What's up everybody? So in this video, we're going to be talking about a special kind of cycle, not a bicycle or a tricycle or any kind of thing like that. We're going to be talking about the carbon cycle. So to better understand the carbon cycle, we're going to look at it 200 years ago, the world 200 years ago, and how the carbon cycle was happening. Now, first of all, what is carbon? Carbon. So carbon is a very small element that makes up everything around us. Like, what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at Ronaldo here. If we look at Ronaldo, we know he is made up of what? He's made up of billions of cells, right? Now, let's take it one step further. What are cells made of? Cells, if we zoom into cells, are made up of little elements. For example, maybe you know the periodic table of elements, right? There's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, all those kinds of elements. Now, the main one that we're made of, that our cells are made of, is carbon. So carbon is very important to understand, and especially how it goes around, the cycle that carbon takes, okay? So basically understand that everything is made up of carbon. All living things are made up of carbon. Now, what happens? What is the cycle that we need to know about? Because not only are we humans made of carbon, so are trees and plants, so are animals. So carbon can come from other places as well that we'll discuss now. So we're going to look at this image and I'm going to put a bunch of arrows on here just like this, and we're going to paint a picture for you to understand what the carbon cycle, the cycle was about carbon around 200 years ago. And you'll understand why I'm going to talk about 200 years ago. So first of all, let's start with Ronaldo. Well, what do? In order to stay alive, we need to do cell respiration, right? To make ATP, to make energy so that we can survive. One of the things that we release as a byproduct is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, right? That's part of the cell respiration cycle. You'll learn that in another chapter if you haven't already. But basically, we make ATP and we also make carbon dioxide, right? It's a waste product. So it gets released out of our mouths into the atmosphere when we exhale. So notice, carbon dioxide has carbon in it. So it's a very important source of carbon. Now, so carbon is released from us, living things, even this little, cow here, right? This one also releases carbon dioxide because it's living. Same with this plant here. All living things can do cell respiration. So we can call this process respiration. Notice how I have red and green arrows here. The red arrows are arrows pointing in the direction of carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere. So respiration is one of them. Let me just label this. Let's just leave that one for now. I won't label the cow just because it's going to take up too many words, but no, the cow also does respiration. Now, so what next? We release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, also another source of carbon dioxide is volcanoes, and they are natural, right? All living things here, everything here is natural. Now, this volcano can also release carbon dioxide, so we can call this volcanic activity can lead to carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere. Now, what happens next? We know that plants can actually take up carbon dioxide. What process does a plant do that uses carbon dioxide? Photosynthesis, right? So a plant can take this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use it in photosynthesis to create itself, to grow and get bigger, right? So that's important. So photosynthesis is one key process that actually removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, because respiration and volcanic activity are two ways in which carbon dioxide is increased in the atmosphere. And I'm going to mention just now why we care about carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Now notice here another green arrow. This one is regarding ocean uptake. So a lot of the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere can go and dissolve into our oceans, the big pools of water. So in a way, ocean uptake is another way in which carbon dioxide can be removed from the atmosphere. Okay, now, say this happens. So say we looked at this idea here. Now say a plant, right? We said it can do photosynthesis. Some organisms can eat plants. So let's say this cow here ate some of this plant. Now notice, remember how I said everything is made up of carbon. So some of the carbon from this plant is now passed on to this cow. Okay, so that makes sense. That's another way in which carbon is transferred. Maybe not into the atmosphere, but it's still a way in which carbon can be transferred from one thing to another. Now, the same way, humans or other organisms can eat other organisms. So this cow may pass on to this human, or this cow may be eaten by another organisms. In that way, again, this cow is made up of carbon. So this carbon is now passed to this human, right? Now both this cow and this human can die, right? It's inevitable. Now let's say we die, rest in peace. Two things can happen to us. One, we can get decomposed, right? If you put a human down there, if the human dies, well, you probably don't see this, but if an organism dies, after a while, a lot of insects and organisms come onto it and start to eat it, start to decompose it, right? So we can say that when you die, one of two things can happen. You can get decomposed by detrivores and saprotrophs. These are organisms that break dead material down, okay? And you'll also learn about these two in another chapter. And I like to remember, detrivore sounds like dead. It breaks down dead things. So again, this is another way in which carbon is transferred from one thing to another. Because even though we die, we are still made up of carbon, meaning the carbon can still go someplace. So in this case, the carbon is digested by these little detrivores and saprotrophs, little organisms that can decompose us. Now, as they break us down, they're basically just eating us. So to stay alive, they also have to do respiration. So these little detrivores can also respire and release the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So they eat us, take some carbon into them, and then they release some carbon by doing respiration, just like we do to stay alive. Now, ultimately, another pathway we can take, so say we die, we can turn into fossil fuels. If millions of years pass, many years, and we start going deeper into the earth because we die and then we go under the soil and then we go deeper and deeper as layers form above us, eventually plants and animals that died can form fossil fuels. All right, fossil fuels. This is basically carbon trapped deep within the earth, in a very compact form, a very compact form because of so much pressure. If you put so many layers on top of you, you're gonna get compressed, squeezed into a little tiny ball of carbon, right? We call this like fossil fuels, and this can include coal, oil, and some kind of gases, right? Now, 200 years ago, we didn't dig this out and burn it, right? We left it. It didn't get released, okay? It kind of stayed in the ground, okay? So this is kind of where the cycle ended. Now, bear this in mind. This is important. Now, why do we care about this carbon dioxide? Because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. What does that mean? A greenhouse gas is a kind of gas that contributes to climate change. Okay, it contributes to global warming. This is the kind of gas that causes the earth to heat up over time. And you'll see about what exactly I mean by this in the next chapter when we talk about greenhouse gases and we talk about climate change. So right now you don't need to know about greenhouse gases. I just want to mention it here so you understand why we care about carbon dioxide. So it's a greenhouse gas, meaning it's a gas that causes the earth to get warmer and warmer if it increases. If there's a normal amount, then it doesn't matter. For example, 200 years ago, the carbon dioxide level was normal. It didn't get affected. This is the cycle. This carbon cycle made sure that carbon dioxide didn't increase too much. It kind of stayed at a stable level, meaning that the earth was the right temperature. Climate change did not occur. So, in summary, 200 years ago, our carbon dioxide levels were normal because there was a balance between this cycle. There was a balance between photosynthesis, respiration, ocean uptake, volcanic activity, and all these processes, this whole cycle, this carbon cycle that kept carbon dioxide at a decent level, okay? But things changed. If we look at this carbon cycle now, one special thing happened. So here we have the same cycle, but I'm gonna add one thing that changed. Notice one arrow that is now contributing to more carbon dioxide. What do you think this arrow is going to be? You can take a guess. Factories, man. Factories. Combustion. The burning of fossil fuels. The burning of fossil fuels. This is happening now more than ever. Not so much 200 years ago. What do I mean by this? So you saw this whole process, and I said that we can form one thing that can happen when organisms die. They can get decomposed, and eventually they can get turned into fossil fuels, right? Which is very compact forms of this carbon that is trapped and can't go anywhere, right? When we die, we're carbon. If we get trapped deep beneath the earth and we can't get released anywhere, we're going to become fossil fuels. And this takes many millions of years, right? But now what happened recently, or not so recently, but in the recent years, is that people started digging out this coal, this oil, this gas, right? This carbon, this fossil fuels, and they took them to factories and started burning them for energy to generate heat, to generate all these things that we need in life. Or we don't need them, but it makes our lives more convenient, right? It makes factories run, makes products be able to be made faster, and all this, so that our Earth can like evolve, right? So that's one thing that's new. Now, this burning of fossil fuels is contributing to much more carbon dioxide than what happened in the past, than what happened 2 years ago. And like I said, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So if this gas increases, so will our climate change, so will our global warming. And global warming is bad for many reasons, which I'll talk about in the next chapter of climate change, right? But so bear in mind, this carbon cycle is important to understand because of these changes that happened over the years, these changes of us contributing to this increased carbon dioxide. This is unnatural, right? This picture of 200 years ago, this is natural. This is what naturally happens in nature. But this process of burning fossil fuels is human, man created, right? This barbecue here, this burning of fossil fuels, all of these things increasing the amount of carbon dioxide. Okay, now real quick, one key like phrase we need to like nail down here is carbon flux. So notice how we have a lot of carbon sources, right? We have the ocean, we have the atmosphere, right? We have all these carbon sources where carbon can go and stay and move from, right? Now, carbon flux, let me read this definition for you. This is the flow of carbon from one carbon pool. Again, carbon pool is these, for example, the ocean, the atmosphere, trees, whatever. It is the net, so it's the flow of carbon from one carbon pool to another. So carbon flux from the ocean to the sky or the atmosphere, that's carbon flux, okay? That is the flow of carbon from one pool to another. Now, in reality, we can define it as the net difference between the carbon removal and the carbon addition. So clearly now we can see that there is more of a carbon addition than there is a carbon removal. So we are causing carbon efflux, carbon increased in the atmosphere. Okay, so that's important to understand, this idea of carbon flux, the movement of carbon from one thing to another. Now, also, one thing I want to add is trees. We know trees is so important in removing this carbon dioxide. But guess what we're doing? Guess what we're doing? We're cutting down so many trees. So not only are we contributing to increased carbon dioxide release, we're also contributing to decreased photosynthesis, decreased removal of that carbon dioxide. So both of these things cause an increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. A terrible, terrible thing, right? For our future. For maybe it's not going to kill us right now, but it's going to kill many people in many distant generations for sure. Okay, so that's the idea of the carbon cycle. So if you understand this idea of 200 years ago, this natural idea, and then the idea of now, you'll understand why we care about this carbon cycle. Now next, there's one key thing we need to understand. So some places on Earth are pretty special. Okay, we can call these special places that I'm about to talk about wetlands. It is just like the name says. It's wet pieces of land, meaning it's basically a land that is covered in water. It is so full. You must have seen these places before on TV or something, or maybe you've been in one. If I make this bigger, because it's pretty tiny there, invincible, you can see it's grass or there's like some kind of plants, and you can see there's water kind of like floating. It's very, very full of water. Let's look at this next one. Same thing here. This one's pretty much the same concept. It's a like land area full of water, saturated in water. Okay, it's very wet. Last one here for you guys, just for you, man, just for you. And again, you can see the plants and there's an animal and it's full of water, saturated. We call these wetlands. Okay, although, man, why are you talking about wetlands? Why? Just tell me why. Okay, let's delete these. This is my drawing of a wetland, okay? Simple drawing here, just because I don't want to use the realistic ones. Always looks more confusing when it's realistic. Now, wetlands, so again, plants here, a lot of water, are special. And one example of a wetland is a peat bog, and you'll see what I mean by peat later, the word peat, okay? This peat is going to be interesting later. Now, these wetlands, okay, don't worry about the word peat bog for now. These wetlands are important, and we're going to talk about them because they kind of influence a little bit the carbon cycle, okay, and you'll see why. Sometimes, okay, here I add some arrows. Sometimes organisms like fish or whatever, or even some plants, they can die, okay, but we're now considering not this kind of environment. We're not considering like a dry area or like here's the ocean, but we're not considering the dry areas and stuff like that. We're considering now this special scenario of a peat bog. Okay, so when things die, like a plant or an animal, what can happen is this. They can die, okay? Again, rest in peace. Now, when they die, the difference is now that normally, like I said, if I show you in the previous image, normally, if you die in like any other place that's not so wet, you can get decomposed by these detrivores and saprotrophs, and they can break you down until you're gone, and in the process, they can respire. Now, the difference is here, a wetland, it is because it's so wet, that there is no oxygen inside there's very low levels of oxygen inside the water, right? Meaning there aren't really organisms that can decompose you so conveniently, okay? That means you cannot get decomposed so easily because there's so much water, okay? So in a wetland has certain conditions that's unique from other places. It is very wet, okay? Because it's very wet, there's low oxygen levels if you under this water, right? And it also causes it to be slightly acidic. You need to know these three conditions, and I'll show you why, because there's an exam question that I'm going to show you at the end why you need to know these three conditions. So wetlands have certain conditions, including wet, low oxygen levels, and they're acidic. And because of these conditions, okay, you cannot be decomposed so easily. Living things that die cannot be decomposed so conveniently. And so what happens is this. Instead, there's going to be little organisms that can survive in this area, but it's not normal organisms. It's not normal organisms like detrivores and saprotrophs that can break you down. These are different. These are called methanogenic bacteria, and you'll see why it's called methanogenic bacteria, also called archaeans. These are anaerobic bacteria. So we just talked about before here these detrivores and saprotrophs. They are aerobic, meaning they survive in air conditions where there's oxygen and all that. Aerobic just means organisms that survive in oxygen conditions, high oxygen conditions. So these detrivores and saprotrophs, they survive in high oxygen conditions, and so when you die, they can break you down, contributing to the carbon cycle. Now, these organisms do not live in high oxygen conditions. They love these wetlands where there's low oxygen conditions, wet and acidic, right? So when you die, you're not going to get broken down by saprotrophs and detrivores or any kind of aerobic bacteria. You're going to get broken down by methanogenic bacteria, specifically anaerobic bacteria, bacteria that don't like oxygen at all. Now, when they break you down, something interesting happens. Instead of releasing carbon dioxide like the saprotrophs and detrivores do, they release another kind of thing, methane, CH4. If you know chemistry, you know this, CH4. Methane, it's a gas as well, just like carbon dioxide, but it's a different kind of gas. Now, methane is a greenhouse gas as well, just like carbon dioxide, but guess what? It is much, much worse, much, much worse. So you know how carbon dioxide can cause global warming if it increases, right? We talked here about nowadays we have this increased carbon dioxide, which is an increase of greenhouse gas, which can increase climate change and global warming. Now methane can do that even worse, okay? It's a really bad greenhouse gas. It is much, much more strong than carbon dioxide, okay? So this is interesting. Now, it is called now I'm going to come back to this. It's called methanogenic bacteria because they produce methane. This is called methane. Okay, so they produce methane when they break down organisms. Now, this methane one of two things can happen. This methane can be turned into carbon dioxide. So some of it can be turned into carbon dioxide, which is again a greenhouse gas. So you can see these wetlands, these conditions, these places that have these conditions can also contribute to the carbon cycle. Because look, they produce carbon dioxide, okay? As a byproduct as well. Now, this CH4 can also be eaten by another bacteria. We call this one methanotrophs. Okay, methanotrophs. These like to eat methane. So remember, these were methanogenic bacteria, meaning they make, genic means to make. So they make methane when they break down an organism. These like to eat methane. So in a way, these methanogenic bacteria are making these methanes, and these methanotrophs are removing them. So there's kind of like an equilibrium here. There's kind of like a nice cycle here. So even though they're being created, some of them are being taken away, right? So that's good. That's good to know. Now, when in the process of removing these methanotrophs make CO2. Okay, so again, this also adds to the kind of carbon cycle. So I hope this makes sense. So in a certain environment, as a summary, organisms die, but because of these harsh conditions that aren't normally present, they cannot be broken down by normal aerobes, so they are broken down by anaerobic bacteria. These anaerobic bacteria can, as they break them down, produce a really bad greenhouse gas called methane. Methane can either be eaten by these methanotropes, which will create carbon dioxide as a byproduct of eating them, or they can be directly oxidized to carbon dioxide, okay? So either way, at the end of the day, we get methane and carbon dioxide, both bad greenhouse gases. But if this is natural, then it's fine. Then this methane is in a stable condition. It's being produced, but also being taken away. Now, what else can make methane? Cows. So remember, cows can make methane. So not only is methane made by these wetlands, cows can make them. And they can also be made by volcanic activity and burning of fossil fuels, okay? So note that some of these things can also make methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And again, I'm sorry, but you won't 100% understand greenhouse gases until the next chapter. I'm just trying to make you aware that they just cause the world to get warmer. They cause climate change. They're very bad. If in excess, if in normal amount, it's good, but if they're in excess, if they're increasing too much, it's very bad news. Okay, now, I hope this makes sense. So you know now the general carbon cycle, right? 200 years ago, you know it, how it happens now, so the changes, what makes it worse, increasing greenhouse gas. And you also know how wetlands, this is a specific kind of environment, how they contribute to methane production and carbon dioxide production because of these harsh conditions. Now, we got to talk about one more thing, peat formation. And trust me, this is not a minor topic. It pops up the whole damn time, so it's really annoying because this peat formation, it seems like, oh, do I really have to know this? Yes, you actually do. And it's frustrating because it's such an annoying, like, kind of tricky topic, but I'm going to make it easy for you, but it's an annoying topic that you think you don't need to know, but you do need to know. So, and I'll show you an exam question at the end, so trust me, you do need to know it. Now, what is peat? So remember these wetlands. I said an example is a peat bog. Now, a peat bog is a kind of wetland that over time causes peat formation. Okay, so over time, something called peat is formed in wetlands. So what do I mean by that? Peat is like soil, kind of like a soil, a very special kind of soil. And you'll see what I mean. So let's look here. If we look inside this scenario, so there's water. This is a plant underwater. Here's some sand or whatever, some soil. And this is deep. This is much deeper. Okay. Now, what happens is peat formation is when plants in these wetlands. So you see these plants, they're in the wetland, right? So when these plants inside these wetlands die, something happens. So they will die. Okay, let's say. So let's say there's some death of vegetation. So the vegetation is just a word for plants. So these plants in these wetlands die, right? When they die, remember how I said there's very little oxygen, right? Now, on the surface, the closer you are to the top of the water, the more oxygen, right? That makes sense because oxygen will dissolve, and as it's very deep, there's very little oxygen. So when they die, they're in the surface layer. So there's some oxygen. So they can be composed, right? They can be decomposed. This is very important. So when they die, they're close to the air, right? So there's high oxygen. So they can be decomposed by aerobic organisms, right? Now, when they get decomposed, they are broken down slowly and slowly and slowly, right? That's what decompose means. Now, look at this. Oh yeah, first, examples of these kind of plants that can die this way. Like examples of plants that can be found in wetlands are these. I don't know how important this is, but it's in the book. I wouldn't worry about it much, honestly. I'm just putting it here because it's in the book. Okay, so again, step one, peat formation starts with vegetation dying, okay? This dying vegetation will get partially decomposed because when it dies, it's at the top. It's at the top of all the things below it, right? It's on the top. It's like stacking cards. Now it's on the top. So because it's on the top, it's in the place with the highest oxygen. So it's going to get partially decomposed. Now, as time passes, okay, guess what happens? Things will die on top of it. So layers will start appearing above this dead plant, right? So as time goes on, and I'm talking a lot of time, like thousands of years, man. As time goes on, so it's not just from today to tomorrow, it's thousands of years, then new layers will form above this dead, partially decomposed plant. Now, as new layers form, guess what happens? How far are we away from the oxygen? Very far. So the conditions get very low in oxygen. So now, this partially decomposed vegetation is in a place with very low oxygen, whereas before it was in high oxygen. So when it's in this place of low oxygen, it cannot be broken down anymore. It's broken down really, really, really slowly, okay? And when it's broken down really, really slowly, what does that mean? That means it is not going away, it's staying there. So over time, we're forming these layers and layers of this dead vegetation. And because there's so many layers above it forming, you kind of squish it. You cause compression of all of these dead plants. And the compression of these dead plants over many thousands of years form peat. Okay, peat. And I'll show you a picture very soon of what exactly peat looks like. Let me show you. I'll show you very soon. Just pay attention to it. So it's a very, very special material. Now, so this happens, like I said, over thousands of years. Now, people can dig out this peat and burn it as fuel, okay? So it's a source of energy, okay? But it's a non-renewable source of energy. And what does that mean? That means we use it faster than it's made because it takes thousands of years for peat to form. If we keep digging them out today, tomorrow, the day after, then eventually we're going to run out of peat. So peat is a non-renewable source of energy because we burn it faster than it's created, okay? Just like coal and all those other things. Now, I need to explain something else. Now, as time goes on even more, so this has been thousands of years, as time goes on even more layers are formed right above. And then this dead material, these dead vegetation will go even deeper and become something else, fossil fuels. So there's a big difference between peat and fossil fuels. Peat is a decomposed plant that is going deep into this, that is followed by layers of new decomposition over thousands of years, forming compression and pressure, resulting in peat. If millions of years go by, this process will continue to happen, and these decomposed material will get so compact that it becomes fossilized. This is fossil fuels, okay? Fossil fuels. Fossil fuels include coal, oil, and gas, right? So don't get confused. Peat is not a fossil fuel. If you leave peat for millions of years, maybe it will become a fossil fuel. I will explain this more clearly on the next slide, the idea of fossil fuels, okay? So overall, we need to know for peat to form, the production of biomass must be greater than its breakdown, and that makes sense. Remember, it gets decomposed. When it gets too low, there's low oxygen, so it doesn't get decomposed anymore, so layers start forming, layers and layers, because we can't break it down anymore. That is peat. So fossil fuels can be formed both by dead animals and dead plants. So for example, we can also put a fishy here, and if the fish dies, it can also get decomposed, and when oxygen conditions get lower and the pressure gets higher, it can result in eventually in fossil fuels, okay? But peat is only formed by vegetation. So peat is only formed by dead plants over time, whereas fossil fuels can be formed by dead plants like peat and animals. So let me show you. I want to show you a better picture. So here we have a dead plant, dead fish, plant, and animal. Okay, so over a long time, so there's a long time, so millions of years, and there's a long time. Over a long time, we can form peat. So this is finally what I want to show you, peat. Notice, it's like soil. If you dig it out after a few thousand years, you can burn it as energy. It's non-renewable, as I mentioned. But if you leave, so remember, I'm trying to make this clear here. So this bracket here is only referring to this plant. So peat is just formed by decaying vegetation, decaying plants. But now this one is referring to all of them. All of these animals, plants, and fish, after a very long time, so millions of years, can form fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, okay? Fossil fuels, which include coal, oil, and gas. And these are also non-renewable. We know we're running out of them, right? So just, again, important to understand that over a shorter period of time, we can form peat from plants. And if you continue that, they can turn into fossil fuels. But plants, animals, and fish can, over a very long time, turn into fossil fuels. And as I mentioned, wait a sec, that's the problem with nowadays. Now we can dig out these and burn them and create carbon dioxide, right? So that's the trick here. So here I have a word form. Peat can become a fossil fuel over a long time. It is technically not a fossil fuel as its organic material has not fossilized because it wasn't under the floor for long enough, okay? Now here, to emphasize to you how important peat formation is an exam question. Notice acidic conditions, anaerobic conditions, wet conditions, all this stuff, okay? So you need to know it. I'm not joking about it. So I hope that video was useful and see you in the next one.